The microphone slipped from Steve Harvey's hand, but he didn't even notice. For 40 years of television, he'd never seen anything like this. An 89-year-old woman named Rose Wilson stood at the Family Feud podium, her silver hair perfectly curled, wearing a lavender dress that had seen better decades, staring at the game board with the kind of confusion that breaks hearts. But it wasn't her age that stopped Steve cold. It wasn't the way her weathered hands trembled slightly as they gripped the podium. It was what she had just said into that microphone, words that weren't supposed to be there, words that came from somewhere deeper than game show answers, words that transformed a television studio into something sacred. Survey says, Steve had announced with his usual energy, adjusting his tie with that familiar confidence that had made him America's favorite game show host, name something that makes you feel safe. Rose had stepped forward, her movements careful but determined, gripping the podium with hands marked by liver spots and wedding rings worn thin by decades of faithful wearing. She'd looked directly into the camera, past the bright studio lights that made everyone squint, past the audience of 300 people, past everything that made this a television show, and said in a voice clear as crystal, "My husband, Harold. He's been gone 3 years come Christmas, but I still feel safest when I'm talking to him every night before I go to sleep." The studio fell into that particular kind of silence that happens when reality crashes headfirst into entertainment, when the manufactured world of television suddenly becomes uncomfortably real. Steve's practiced smile didn't fade immediately because he was a professional, because he'd handled thousands of unexpected answers, because his career had been built on rolling with whatever contestants threw at him. But something in Rose's eyes, something in the way she said Harold's name like a prayer, like a song she'd been singing for 60 years, made him understand that this wasn't confusion. This wasn't a senior moment. This was love speaking its eternal truth. Behind Rose, her family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Her grandson David, 24, tall and nervous in his first suit, who had brought her to fulfill what he thought was a simple bucket list wish, now wondered if this had been a mistake. Her daughter-in-law Patricia, 52, a nurse who had spent the morning patiently explaining the rules over and over, worried about exactly this kind of moment. They'd driven 8 hours from Cedar Falls, Iowa, 3 generations squeezed into an old Buick that smelled like Rose's lavender perfume and David's coffee, because Rose had insisted with the kind of stubborn determination that families recognize as non-negotiable. What they hadn't told the producers during the pre-show interviews, what they hadn't told Steve during the brief contestant meet and greet, what they barely admitted to themselves during those long conversations in hospital waiting rooms, was that this was likely Rose's last truly good day. Alzheimer's had been stealing pieces of her for 2 years, taking memories like a thief in slow motion, leaving gaps where grandchildren's names used to be, where recipes passed down through generations once lived, where the accumulated wisdom of nearly 9 decades slowly disappeared into fog. But today somehow, miraculously, she was sharp. Today she remembered their names without prompting, remembered where they were going and why it mattered, remembered the stories that made her who she was. Today Rose Wilson was completely herself, perhaps for the last time. Steve walked closer to the podium, his instincts as a seasoned entertainer telling him to move the game along, to treat this like any other senior moment that could be handled with gentle humor and a smooth transition back to the game. The producers in the control room were already gesturing frantically, trying to signal him to keep the energy up, to maintain the pace that made good television. But when Steve looked into Rose's eyes, he saw something that stopped him completely. She wasn't confused. She wasn't lost in the fog of dementia. She was completely present, completely aware, and she was sharing something sacred in the most unlikely of places. "Mrs. Rose," Steve said gently, setting down his cards and giving her his full attention, "tell me about Harold." The producers in the control room started whispering frantically into their headsets, their voices carrying that edge of panic that comes when live television starts going off script. This wasn't how Family Feud worked. This wasn't the format. This wasn't what focus groups and market research had determined would hold audience attention. But Steve Harvey had learned long ago, through decades of stand-up comedy and dive bars and television tapings that never quite went as planned, that some moments were bigger than formats, bigger than schedules, bigger than everything that made television what it was supposed to be. Rose's face lit up with a smile that transformed her completely, erasing decades from her features and revealing the young woman who had once danced until dawn and believed the whole world was full of possibilities. "Harold Wilson," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "We met at a church dance in Cedar Falls in 1953. I was 19, wearing my mother's blue dress that I'd altered to be more fashionable. Harold was 21, wearing his Navy uniform, fresh back from Korea with stories he wouldn't tell until years later. The audience, which had been fidgeting and uncertain, unsure whether to laugh or applaud or sit in respectful silence, grew completely still. Steve found himself leaning against the podium, no longer hosting but listening, no longer performing but witnessing something extraordinary. "He was the handsomest man I'd ever seen," Rose continued, her words flowing like water over stones, smooth and practiced from decades of telling. "Dark hair, blue eyes that seemed to see right through to your soul, and this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He asked me to dance to Moon River, and I knew right then, standing in that church basement with the crepe paper decorations and the borrowed phonograph, that I was going to marry him." Steve's throat tightened. He'd heard love stories before, countless contestants sharing brief anecdotes about their spouses, but something about the way Rose spoke, the absolute certainty in her voice, the way she made Harold seem present in that studio despite being gone for 3 years, was different. This wasn't nostalgia. This was active, living love. "How long were you married, Mrs. Rose?" Steve asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its television polish. 57 years, 4 months, and 12 days, Rose replied without hesitation. 57 years of him making me coffee every morning in that old percolator we got as a wedding gift, of me packing his lunch for the factory where he worked for 38 years, of us dancing in the kitchen when the radio played our song, of him reading me the newspaper every Sunday because my eyes got bad and I was too proud to get glasses. Steve felt something shift in his chest, that recognition that comes when you realize you're in the presence of something rare and precious. "Mrs. Rose, what would Harold say if he could see you right now, standing up here on this stage?" Rose's eyes filled with tears, but her smile never wavered, never lost its luminous quality. "He'd say, 'Rosie, you're still the prettiest girl at the dance.' That's what he called me from the day we met until the day he died. Rosie, never Rose, never Mrs. Wilson, always Rosie. And you know what, Mr. Steve? When I close my eyes at night, when the house gets so quiet it feels like the whole world has gone to sleep, I can still hear him saying it." The camera operators, who had seen thousands of tapings, found themselves wiping their eyes behind their equipment. In the control room, hardened television veterans who usually focused on ratings and commercial breaks were reaching for tissues. Behind the scenes, Steve Harvey made a decision that defied every television convention he'd ever known, every rule he'd learned in 4 decades of entertainment. The cameras kept rolling, but Steve Harvey stopped being a game show host. He walked around the podium with deliberate steps, stood directly in front of Rose Wilson, and spoke in a voice that carried across the silent studio with the weight of absolute sincerity. "Mrs. Rose, I have an idea, but I need to ask your family something first." He turned to David and Patricia, who were watching with expressions that mixed worry, pride, and growing amazement. "Would you mind if we did something a little different here? Something I've never done in all my years of hosting this show?" David, who had been worried about his grandmother's confusion, who had spent the drive rehearsing gentle explanations about game show rules and television etiquette, nodded immediately. Whatever Steve Harvey wanted to do, it had to be better than the awkward situation he'd been preparing to manage. Patricia, who knew her mother-in-law's condition better than anyone, who had watched this brilliant woman slowly disappear into the fog of disease, saw something in Rose's eyes that she hadn't seen in months: complete clarity, complete presence, complete joy. "Mr. Harvey," she said, "Rose hasn't been this happy, this herself, in a very long time. Whatever you want to do, we trust you." Steve walked to the production booth and had a whispered conversation that lasted 30 seconds but felt like an eternity to everyone watching. When he returned, he was carrying something that made the entire studio hold its breath: a small portable speaker, the kind used for sound checks and warm-ups. "Mrs. Rose," Steve said, his voice carrying that particular gentleness reserved for sacred moments, "you mentioned Moon River, Harold's song. Your song, the song you danced to on the night you fell in love." He held up the speaker with reverence, as if it contained something precious. "Would you like to dance with him one more time?" The studio gasped audibly, a sound like wind through leaves, like surprise made manifest. This wasn't just breaking protocol, this was transforming television into something it had never been before, something holy and real and utterly unprecedented. Rose's hands trembled as she reached towards Steve, not from age or infirmity, but from the overwhelming emotion of being offered something she thought was lost forever. "He's not here, Mr. Steve. Harold's been gone 3 years come Christmas. He died in his sleep, peaceful as you please, after making me coffee one last time." Steve gently took her hands, feeling the weight of decades in those fragile fingers, the strength that had carried her through nearly 9 decades of joy and sorrow. "Mrs. Rose, love like what you and Harold shared? That doesn't go anywhere when someone dies. It doesn't disappear into the ground or float away into heaven. It changes form, but it never leaves. He's here. I can feel him in the way you say his name. This whole studio can feel him." The music began softly, those opening notes of Moon River flowing through the speakers like a memory made audible, like time folding back on itself to reveal that some things are eternal. Steve stepped back, giving Rose space, and something miraculous happened. Rose Wilson began to sway, her eyes closed, her arms moving as if she were being held by invisible hands that knew exactly how to lead her. Her feet, in sensible shoes that had carried her through decades of daily life, began to move in patterns remembered by muscle and heart. But she wasn't dancing alone. Every person in that studio could see it, could feel it, could witness the impossible reality of love that transcends death. She was dancing with Harold. The audience rose to their feet without being prompted, not in applause but in reverence, recognizing that they were witnessing something that belonged in cathedrals, not television studios. The competing families abandoned their podiums and formed a protective circle around Rose, instinctively understanding that this moment needed to be sheltered from anything that might intrude upon its beauty. Steve's voice, thick with emotion that he made no attempt to hide, spoke over the music. "Harold Wilson, sir, if you can hear me wherever you are, you've got one heck of a dancing partner down here. And Mrs. Rose, you're still the prettiest girl at the dance." Rose opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face, but her smile radiant with a joy that seemed to light the entire studio. "Can you see him, Mr. Steve? Can you see my Harold? He's right here, holding me just like he did for 57 years. Steve looked at this remarkable woman, at the way the studio lights caught her silver hair like a halo, at the dignity in her posture despite her age, at the love that seemed to emanate from her like warmth from a fireplace. He thought about his own marriage, his own family, his own understanding of what it meant to love someone so completely that death becomes just another dance move to navigate together. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of truth. "I can see him." The song played for 3 minutes and 27 seconds. In that time, a television studio became a ballroom from 1953, a game show became a celebration of enduring love, and 89-year-old Rose Wilson danced with her husband one last time, proving that some bonds are too strong for death to break, too real for time to diminish, too beautiful for anything in this world to destroy. When the music ended, Rose walked directly to Steve and embraced him with a strength that surprised everyone who witnessed it, the strength of a woman who had been given the greatest gift imaginable. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Harold always loved to dance, and I know he's been waiting for me to dance again." Steve held her gently, this remarkable woman who had just taught an entire studio about the persistence of love, about the reality of connections that transcend physical presence. "Mrs. Rose, you just reminded all of us what really matters in this life." But the moment that would be replayed millions of times, that would become part of television legend, came next. Steve removed his suit jacket, the same lucky jacket he'd worn for countless tapings, the one that had been with him through triumphs and disasters, through the highest-rated shows and the most challenging moments of his career, and draped it carefully around Rose's shoulders. "This jacket has been with me through every show I've ever hosted," he said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. "But today it belongs to the classiest lady who ever graced this stage. You wear this home, Mrs. Rose, and every time you put it on, you remember that Harold's love is still with you, still keeping you warm, still making you the prettiest girl at the dance." The studio erupted in applause, not the manufactured excitement of game show audiences, but the deep emotional recognition of something authentic and beautiful and true. It was the kind of applause reserved for moments that remind us of our own capacity for love, our own connections to people who have shaped us, our own understanding of what makes life worth living. Rose wore Steve's jacket for the remainder of the taping, which continued not as a competition but as a celebration. Both families played together, sharing stories of their own love stories, their own losses, their own moments of dancing in kitchens, and finding safety in each other's arms. The questions became opportunities for connection rather than competition, and the studio became a place where strangers became family united by the recognition of love's enduring power. 6 months later, when the episode aired on a quiet Tuesday evening, it became the most watched Family Feud episode in television history. Social media exploded with viewers sharing their own stories of enduring love, their own experiences of feeling the presence of those they'd lost, their own memories of dancing in kitchens and church basements and anywhere music played and hearts were full. But more importantly, Rose and Harold's dance sparked something beautiful across the country. Nursing homes began hosting Harold and Rose dances, where residents could dance to the music of their youth while sharing stories of their own great loves. Community centers organized similar events. Families began talking more openly about the people they'd lost, the love that persisted, the ways that death is not the end of connection but simply a change in its form. Steve Harvey received thousands of letters from viewers sharing their own stories of enduring love, of loss that couldn't diminish connection, of the ways love persists even when the physical presence is gone. He read every single one, keeping them in a special file that reminded him why his work mattered beyond entertainment value. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Steve himself. In interviews months later, he would say that Rose Wilson taught him the difference between entertainment and ministry, between making people laugh and helping them remember what makes life beautiful. She changed his approach to hosting, his understanding of his role, his appreciation for the stories that ordinary people carry. Rose Wilson passed away peacefully 8 months after the taping, surrounded by her family, wearing Steve's jacket. Her grandson David wrote to Steve, telling him that in her final moments Rose had smiled and said, "Tell Mr. Steve that Harold and I are dancing again, and thank him for reminding me that love never really leaves us." The jacket was returned to Steve with a note. "She wore this every day until the end. She said it helped her remember that love never really leaves us. It just takes different forms. Thank you for giving her that last dance with Harold." Steve Harvey kept that jacket in his dressing room for the rest of his career, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when you stop performing and start witnessing the extraordinary love that ordinary people carry in their hearts, ready to share if someone just takes the time to listen. The episode became legendary, not because of its entertainment value, but because it captured something increasingly rare in modern media, a moment of pure, unguarded humanity that reminded viewers that love is the most powerful force in the universe, transcending time, transcending death, transcending everything except the hearts that choose to keep it alive. And somewhere, in that studio, during those 3 minutes and 27 seconds of Moon River, Rose Wilson danced with Harold one last time, proving that some things are too strong to die, too beautiful to forget, and too real to dismiss as anything other than the closest thing to magic that exists in this world.